Alrighty, everybody, we're going to talk about the video you just watched. Okay, so if you're in this unit, you should have already watched this video in real time. It's about 5 minutes long. It's no big deal. This is a video that was made about a fella named Ernie Brown Jr. This is not me in the video. It's not my video. I didn't make it. I'm not the guy in it or anything like that. So I'm taking no ownership of it. Now, when you watch outdoor TV shows, this guy had a TV show on the History Channel for a while called Call of the Wild Man or something like that. But it was one of these outdoor shows. When you watch any kind of outdoor show, of course, be entertained by funny characters and stuff like that. But also look at the habitats in the background around these people and listen to what they're saying, and you're gonna learn a whole lot. And I'm gonna show you kind of how I watch an outdoor video, and I'm gonna pick apart what I see in terms of water quality and what's going on in the habitat just in the background as this is playing. So let's watch Ernie Brown Jr. Okay, so we're just going to stop here first of all. So he gets off in this pond, and first of all, he has very little to fear, which is interesting to me. But let's take a look at the water. Now, I can't see down into that water at all. I don't think you can either. The water is almost entirely opaque, which means it is not clear. It's not transparent, right? It's not clear or transparent because it is highly turbid. And this is what we would call extreme turbidity or high turbidity. High turbidity is the opposite of clarity. So turbidity is the opposite of clarity. The more turbid it is, the less clear it is, okay? So this is extremely turbid water, and it doesn't even flow normally. It kind of looks like super thin peanut butter or super thin mud, which is kind of what it is. And what's going on with turbidity is that, water molecules stick together, right? So they stick together. It's called the property of cohesion. They also stick to other things, which is the property of adhesion. You remember all that from biology. Well, when they hold up other molecules, kind of like the way mortar holds up bricks, right? Then there's bricks with mortar all the way around it. It's kind of like that. The water molecules have suspended all of these dirt particles all the way through the water column, and those dirt particles are blocking the light. So it's just like hiding behind a brick wall. If you could imagine a brick wall with just the mortar and not the bricks, then light would go through it just fine. But if you put the bricks in, then you get quite a shadow, right? And that's exactly what's happening here with this water. This high turbidity is blocking the sunlight from going through the water column, which prevents all plant growth, or what we call submergent, or submerged under the water plant growth from creating oxygen through photosynthesis. So I know that this little pond that he's in has practically no oxygen in it because of the turbidity. Also, I know that there's hardly any living things in it because there has to be a bottom of the food chain, right? There has to be producers. And if it's so turbid that we can't have plants, we can't have herbivores, in which case we can't have a food web. So most of this ecosystem is a dead ecosystem. And I can tell that immediately just from looking at the water. That plant growth in the back is called typha. It's what most people would call cattails, but it's actually looks like there's some sawgrass in there and stuff like that. All right, so he just said something about look for bubbles. Let me explain what those bubbles are. I just told you that there's no oxygen in that water, and there's no submergent plant growth because of the turbidity, which is all true. So you're probably sitting there going, Randy, what's the bubbles then? Is it the turtle breathing out? Well, in which case, it may be the turtle exhaling to some extent. When he sees these bubbles going out through this pond, well, it's got to be a turtle. How does he know it has to be a turtle? Why wouldn't it be anything else? Because there's almost nothing else. It has to be something that breathes air because there's no oxygen in the water, right? So it could be an exhalation of the turtle, but having seen this in the wild, having seen it with alligators, having seen it with snapping turtles, these are common snapping turtles that he's catching. What they do is they run across the bottom, and they're kind of swimming and kind of running across the bottom of this pond. And on the bottom of the pond is this layer of decomposing grass, vegetation, and this typha, or you see right here on this corner here, you can see the seed pods of the cattails, that foof off into this little powder stuff. All that stuff goes to the bottom and rots. And that turtle runs across this layer of rotting vegetation and whatnot that's decomposing, and it releases methane gas. Okay, methane gas is CH4. CH4. So you've got a carbon molecule and 4 hydrogen molecules coming off that. And we're going to talk about where all this hydrogen came from in a minute. But when things decompose, then they're going to make CO2 if there's enough oxygen. When there's not very much oxygen, which we know about this water, then it's going to create CH4, methane gas, or as the British say, methane. This is one of my favorite lines in the video. He's standing here talking to the interviewer, and he says, "Well, what do you catch out here?" And he's like, bullfrog, maybe fish, a fish, maybe snake, maybe 2. So what already there's hardly anything living in this ecosystem at all because of the water quality. And when you get a dead ecosystem like that, the water quality goes to garbage like that, then the biodiversity drops significantly. The net primary productivity drops extremely. This ecosystem not going very far. And when the guy asks him what you catch, and he's like, maybe a fish, maybe a frog, that's bad. That's a bad sign, right? And then the interviewer goes, or typhoid, which is a waterborne disease, bacterial disease that comes from feces. Most people have heard the term typhoid Mary or heard reference to the typhoid epidemics. And that came from people not washing their hands after they use the bathroom. So the interviewer is sort of implying there's a bunch of feces, poop in this water, and that there are bacterial diseases in the water. And the interviewer may very well be right. And Ernie has no idea what typhoid is. And he's like, water snakes? Like, he has no clue what he's swimming around in, which is kind of funny. Okay, so he goes on to some theatrics. Now let's talk about this plant growth in the background. So you see Ernie's Dodge truck. I totally want one of those. Anyway, just like that, actually, with like 4 different colors and, barely runs and stuff. Anyway, you look at the extreme amount of plant growth behind him. Not the trees. I'm not talking about the big oak trees and stuff in the background. I'm talking directly around Ernie here. There's an extreme amount of plant growth. Nitrogen and phosphorus cause plant growth like that. Cause sort of this huge amount of plant growth. Now, where might all that nitrogen and phosphorus come from, right? So keep that in mind. We're gonna get to that in just a few minutes when he hits this next pond. But remember, there's a huge amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's a huge amount of methane, and you're gonna get into some chemistry here in a minute. But notice that look right here by the pond. Okay, so everywhere that the water touches that grass, it's starting to die. That implies extremely low pH. It means that water is very acidic. pH from 0 to 7 is acidic. 7 to 14 is basic. Most water is supposed to be somewhere around, like the ocean is usually around an 8. And I've seen pretty productive ponds that were as low as like 5.8, 5.5 even. I've caught bass in ponds that are 5.5. Now, Ernie's swimming around here. These are probably 3 or 4 on the pH scale. Very, very acidic water in a not living ecosystem or barely living ecosystem. Okay, let's right here, perfect. Oh, I gotta go back just a second. All right, let's take a look at this right here. So we have, again, look at the far background back there. We've got a huge amount of plant growth. So this tells me this is a different pond now. This is a different pond, but that tells me we've got a very similar condition. We've got nitrogen and phosphorus are through the roof. We've got a colossal amount of plant growth, but look at the water. Soon as the water hits the water line, there's no more vegetation. All there is this floating vegetation. It's sort of this green, it appears to be sort of this green film out across the water. And that is a floating type of vegetation called duckweed. And it is probably similar to a lily pad, I guess, if you think about it, but it's tiny, 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 tiny. It has some little roots hanging down, and it has these little floating leaves. Now, again, they float kind of like a lily pad. It's just like 1/1000th of the size. And tiny, tiny little plants. that are floating on the surface of the water. You might think that those are submergent because the roots are submerged. They are not, because they're doing all of their gas transfer through their leaves, and they're getting all of their light through the air. They're not having to fight with the turbidity because they're not under the water, okay? All they're doing with this water is they're getting their nitrogen and phosphorus that they need, probably the sulfur that they need as well from the water. They're essentially putting down roots in this dirty water, almost like it's mud, like it's soil practically. Now you can see right here that this pond has a particular gray color, and I'll talk about that in a second. Look again, look at that sort of grayish black color. Sometimes when water is very, very clear, it appears black because all the light is just disappearing down to the bottom. Like sometimes the sea can look black if you've ever been like deep sea fishing or something like that. That's not what we're seeing here. This is more of a mottled gray color. Right. Like right here, you can see that gray. Look at that gray mud. That sort of dead gray color like that implies almost universally, that implies anaerobic decomposition. Anaerobic decomposition, which means decomposition without oxygen, with no presence of oxygen. So I already know as soon as I saw that, like, yep, when all the soil underneath there is anaerobic like that, there's no oxygen in this water. Ooh, man, this is public enemy number one when it comes to water quality. Anytime you've got a large amount of organisms, and now this can be, it's not just cows, okay? It can be cattle, it can be chickens, it can be hogs, or pigs, or whatever your livestock is. It can be ostriches, it doesn't matter. But when you have a huge amount of organisms confined in an area, and you're feeding those animals constantly, that animal is defecating or pooping constantly, regardless of what kind of animal it is. And all of that material runs down into the water. We're going to get a huge amount of nitrogen compounds from proteins too. You get your phosphorus from proteins in the feces, in the manure. But the nitrogen comes from urea, uric acid, and ammonia, ammonium, NH compounds. So it's nitrogen and hydrogen compounds. Now, the phosphorus comes in defecated or wasted proteins and shed cells, that sort of thing, even dead organisms. Remember, every living cell has got phosphorus in it, right? So there's phosphorus all over the place in the living world. Now, all that material runs down in the water. Hydrogen ions are released. The definition of an acid is anything that creates hydrogen ions in solution. So these nitrogen and phosphorus compounds are coming in. They're causing an extreme amount of plant growth. They're causing an extreme amount of algae growth. That algae uses up the nitrogen and phosphorus, dies, and begins to decompose on the bottom without oxygen. The bacteria that is doing the decomposition without oxygen is going to create CH4, methane. It would create CO2, but again, this is an anaerobic process because we've caused hypoxia. Once it all dies, the bacteria use up all the oxygen. That's called hypoxia. Hypo meaning low, oxygen. Low oxygen is what that means. And now we're doing anaerobic decomposition, which causes an extreme amount of methane gas, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Also, the water is full of hydrogen ions, so the water has become very, very acidic. Remember, this all comes back to this livestock, okay? Teeth knocked out by a chainsaw. All right, so look at all this dead typha back here. All of that's going to fall down into the water and again begin to decompose and cause more acidity, more hypoxia, and so on and so forth. And so just to recap, I've got about 20 seconds left on this video. We've covered hypoxia, we've covered nitrogen and phosphorus compounds, we've covered fecal coliform bacteria in the water, we've covered the algae bloom cycle that leads to hypoxia in a dead zone. We've talked about excess plant growth, we've talked about runoff, we've talked about food webs. There's a lot in here. So go back and rewatch this. Go ahead and speed it up to 2.0 or 1.75 and make sure you caught all the vocab.